Yesterday I released probably my first Words That Fudge video on the word spiritual, and I'll be interested to continue to see what the comments have to say about that video, because I know step on some toes, because there's a lot of people who have grabbed on to this spiritual but not religious thing. Now this morning I saw a very interesting piece from the Pew Research Center. They do a lot of interesting research about words and religious belief in America. And they just came out with a new typology, the religious typology, a new way to categorize Americans by religion. You have Sunday stalwarts, you have God and 17%, God and country believers, 12%. If you listen to the news, you would imagine that that's more like 50%. No, about 12%. 11% divisively devout, 17% relaxed religious, 15% spiritually awake, 12% religion resistors, and 17% solidly secular. Now, for those of you who listen to the podcast version of this without the visuals, this might be a little difficult to follow, but I'll do my best. Let me pull up the web page here. So this is the web page, and I'll put it in the notes and you can read it. It's got some brief descriptions of who these people are, and basically it boils people down into highly religious, somewhat religious, and non-religious. 3 of the 7 groups are composed of highly religious Americans who are united by a traditional view of God and by the shared conviction that organized religion is generally a force for good in American life. Sunday stalwarts are the most religious of the 7 typology groups. They have a high level of involvement in religious congregations and actively practice their faith. God and country believers are less active in church groups or other religious organizations, but like Sunday stalwarts, they hold many traditional religious beliefs and tilt right on the social and political issues. Divisively devout include a relatively large share of racial and ethnic minorities. They are also diverse in their beliefs. It is the only group in which most people say they believe in God as is described in the Bible, and in which majorities say they believe in psychics, reincarnation, and that spiritual energy can be located in physical things like mountains, trees, and crystals. Now, this is a very interesting mix here, because this gets into, in some ways, some of these subtle differences between these very difficult words to define, like religious and spiritual. So spiritual energy. Well, what exactly do you mean by spiritual energy? This is very much, this spiritual energy is in some ways, is this God 1 energy or God 2 energy? And as I continue to think about my God 1 and God 2 definitions, this kind of spirituality is a lot of woo-woo and very emphasis on God aspect 2. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the 3 religious groups are 2 non-religious groups characterized by their tendencies to seldom or never attend religious services, rarely pray, and reject belief in God or the Bible. Instead, believing in another higher power or spiritual force, or in no higher power at all. The solidly secular are the least religious of 7 groups. Now, religious or least spiritual? See, right away you begin with this article to begin to have questions about, what do you mean by religious? And what do you mean by spiritual? Because these words are not very easy to nail down, partly because of these competing groups. These relatively affluent, highly educated U.S. adults, mostly white and male, tend to describe themselves as neither religious nor spiritual. Religion resistors, on the other hand, largely consider themselves spiritual but not religious. And we're going to look at the data a little bit more closely when we look at some of these. So they're spiritual but not religious. Another unifying characteristic is their opposition to organized religion. In between the 3 highly relaxed and 2 non-religious categories stand 2 additional typology groups, the relaxed religious and the spiritually awake. Notice how they're playing on these 2 words. And try to discern because they're not defined here. They're simply imagining that we're all on the same page in terms of what we consider religious and what we consider spiritual. And I think that's far from the case. Most relaxed religious Americans say they believe in the God of the Bible, and 4 in 10 pray daily, but relatively few attend religious services or read scriptures. This would be what might be called the Christ-haunted. These are groups of people that churches usually go after to try to activate, to get them, to have them in a sense switch categories. But relatively few attended religious. Okay. All spiritually awake Americans hold at least some New Age beliefs, psychic, spiritual energy can be located in physical objects, etc., and believe in God and some higher power, though many do not believe in God as described in the Bible, and relatively few attend religious services on a weekly basis. While these typology groups were assembled without regard to religious affiliation, it is still revealing to analyze the religious composition of each group. Each has its distinguishing markers, but none of the typology groups is religiously uniform. And every major religious tradition is represented within multiple typology groups. Sunday stalwarts, for example, are largely Protestants, but also include Catholics, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Jews. And while most solidly secular are religiously unaffiliated, their ranks also include Americans who identify as Protestants, Catholics, and Jews among them. So I've got a slide here where I put the two, get to the presentation, where I put the two tables together, because when I was kind of going through this morning, trying to see what I could discern from this very interesting study, I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, how does this work? And in some ways, what is most telling about the typology are not only the questions, but which questions people either rank very high on or very low on. For example, Sunday stalwarts are pretty much defined by participate in church groups. Now that's a little bit separate from attending religious services weekly. Now groups like Barna have long noted that, Barna and also Gallup have long noted that people on surveys say they attend church more often than they actually attend church. So those numbers could be quite high. But notice the God and country believers and participate in church groups. And this is one of the things that we noted during the Trump election, that a lot of people who, especially during the primaries, during the generals, people acted more differently, because then you have the pull of the parties. But when they looked at people who were quote-unquote evangelicals who supported Trump early on in the primaries, most of those people weren't churchgoers, but they were the God and country believers. And so now you sort of have the difference between people for whom nationalism and Christianity have a very tight bond, and others for whom their Christianity and their nationalism are a bit separated. And, you know, again, I see in the media often played out the strong tie between evangelicals and Trump voters. Well, once you get down into the details, things get quite a bit more complex. And so then if you go all the way down to, so your God and country believers, you know, they don't attend church groups hardly at all. Diversely devout, a little bit more. Now remember, these are traditionally religious, but majorities also believe in psychics, reincarnation, spiritual energies that can be in physical objects. That's the surveyors attempt to assess this rather amorphic group that we might call New Age. Sometimes they'll go to church, but you know, what kind of church? There are churches that actually also major in those kinds of things as well. They're, in a sense, they're in a sense beyond the main line, and you can find them because they're not only, let's say, inclusive of sexual minorities like LGBT issues, but they'll also be very much emphasize God is the God of the Mormons and the Muslims and the Hindus, and they'll very much be sort of on that spectrum. But then you get to the somewhat religious groups, and you'll see how participation in church groups really stays 0, 0, 0, or 2, 4, 2, 3. And so you really see how churches are very much, in many ways, often for the really convinced, and you can see how the really convinced are, because they not only will drift into a Sunday service, but they'll be on church boards, they'll participate in small groups, so on and so forth. Now, as we go down the column on the left side, say they are somewhat, now we get the religious and spiritual thing, say that they are very or somewhat spiritual. Well, church people, well, they'll use the word spiritual, but they'll probably mean something different by it. And you'll see that even God and country and spiritual God and country believers, less than 1% of them participate in church groups. 91% call themselves spiritual, 85% call themselves religious. And then the diversely about, their spiritual and religious is about the same. But now notice where the religious breaks down. You go all the way to the non-religious groups. Okay, this is by definition. But you look at those who call themselves spiritual, even among the solidly secular, 22%. So you could have perhaps Sam Harris in that group. So let's look at religious beliefs. Believe in God as described in the Bible. 94% Sunday stalwarts. 92% God and country. Now they believe in God and the Bible, but participation in church, not necessarily. And again, this is very consistent with my experience. Somewhat religious, again, kind of tails off, but still pretty high. 68 believe. These are the relaxed religious. Now, again, the relaxed religious say it's not necessary to believe in God as a moral to believe in God to be a moral person, because nobody thinks themselves immoral, even people in jail. But religion is important to them, but few engage in traditional practices. Now, again, you get to the religious resistors, and they're very low in there. Believe that the God in the Bible is the Word of God and should be taken literally. Now, I was just thinking this morning, I'll probably have to do a Words That Fudge video on the word literal. I was reading Andrew Sweeney's piece that he just posted on Amazon, which was not on Amazon, on Medium, which was an excellent piece. And I noticed that Jordan Peterson just released the two videos from Vancouver on his channel today, so those will, we'll be talking about those for a bit. But notice literally. Notice how low the literal numbers are, though. In the Sunday stalwarts, 54%. The God and there are issues with this word literal that everybody knows, and this is, I think, part of the reason literal is a word that we use to fudge. Okay, look at how fast the literal drops off. Now we're getting into questions of secularity, all right? Say it's necessary to believe in God to be moral. Notice the Sunday stalwarts are only 62% there. And that is very much the influence of, I think, probably quite a bit of preaching, where, and people who go to church regularly and participate in church groups know how immoral church people are and have come to terms with that. But look at the God and country believers. 93%. Their nationalism and their religiosity are deeply tied. Look at the diversely devout. Say it's necessary to believe in God and be moral. 99%. That's practically the definition of that group. And again, the group is described here as traditionally religious, but majorities also believe in psychics, reincarnation, and that spiritual energies can be located in physical objects. In other words, for them, even though they've got these practices that would not be permitted in ancient Israel according to the Mosaic law, well, that can get into debate. That's practically the definition of this group, that to be a Bible, to the God of the Bible and morality are one thing. That's fascinating. And then that question just goes nowhere with the rest of the groups. Believe in heaven. Here's another interesting one. The first two categories, highly religious and the relaxed religious and spiritually awake, lot believe in heaven in the 90s all across the board, until you get to the non-religious groups, some of whom still consider themselves spiritual. Remember, 68% say they are somewhat spiritual, 22% say they are somewhat spiritual, Belief in heaven drops down to 12 and 4. About belief in hell. Pretty strong among the highly religious groups. Quite strong, 78% among the somewhat religious groups. And then down to the non-religious groups, 5 and 2. Very low. Believe there is spiritual energy located in physical things such as mountains, trees, and crystals. This is the definition of New Agers, according to them. Sunday stalwarts, 29%. You've got some of those in church. Some of those go to church regularly. You know, almost 30%. That's a big number. Notice the God and country, 0. Fascinating. Not into the New Age thing. Into their nationalism. These are very Enlightenment people, okay? These are highly secular people. So that's a fascinating number. Then the diversely religious, 95%. Well, that's practically the definition of that group, which leads to such a high number. But then go down to the relaxed religious. This is obviously how the pollsters differentiated these groups. 0. Relaxed religious are, say it's not necessary to believe in God to be a moral person. Religion is important to them, but few engage in traditional practices. 0 on the New Age scale and the relaxedly religious, but 99% on the spiritually awake. Again, that defines those two groups. But look at the religion resistors, 98% say that. That's a huge number, and less than 1% of the secular. So what you really see here is that these words that Pew is using to define New Age spirituality is really a test of secularity. And you have the highly secular groups being the God and country believers, the relaxed religious believers, and the solidly secular people. Sources of meaning. This is such an interesting survey. Derive a great deal of meaning fulfillment from their religious belief. 87% of the Sunday stalwarts. 67% of the God and country. Now, I would love to ask them about the way they derive meaning from their nationalistic religious beliefs. That would probably be close to 100 for them, because being an American is how they derive meaning. So they will be deeply invested in politics. They will be, their presidential candidate can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and they'll still vote for him. Well, there might be, I'm sure there's Democrats in there too. I don't want to make this as Democrat and Republican thing, but that's the level here. Derive meaning and fulfillment from their religious beliefs, 53%. But now, obviously, you've been testing for this word religion. So now we're going to go to spirit. So your non-religious groups are 1%. But your relaxed religious is 24%. That's still pretty low. Derive a great deal of meaning fulfillment from spiritual practices such as meditation. Now, I was just chatting with Nathan Carey, and we were via email, and we're going to do a conversation coming up in a couple of weeks. And we were talking about what do we mean by meditation. There's another word that we use to fudge. Christians meditate. Buddhists meditate. What's the relationship between Christian and Buddhist meditation? Now you get into the Dallas Willard camp, and this gets very interesting because it gets very interesting. So, derive a great deal of meaning fulfillment from spiritual practices, just as meditation. 41% of the Sunday stalwarts, less than 50%. 24% of the God and country believers, pretty low. 28% of the diversely devout, pretty low. 5% of the relaxed religious, very low. 23% of the spiritually awake. Spirituality doesn't seem to afford a lot of meaning and purpose. All of those numbers are low, as opposed to religiosity in the top one, for whom obviously the churchgoers find it the most meaningful and the most fulfilling. Pew does a lot of very interesting studies, so if you go to their website, and these often get picked up by major news pieces across the spectrum. Derive a great deal of meaning and fulfillment by being outdoors and experiencing nature. Now here again, they're trying to, how are we going to deal with the spiritual but not religious crew? So outdoors and nature, 42% Sunday stalwart, 39% God and country, 59% diversely devout. Again, traditionally religious, but majorities also believe in psychics, reincarnation, and that spiritual energy can be located in physical objects. 60%, pretty big number. Now the relaxed religious and spiritually awake, 36% and 58%, it's a pretty big number for the spiritually awake. But now 64% of the religious resistors. Most think that organized religion does more harm than good, politically liberal and democratic. Very interesting. Politically liberal and democratic, they love their national parks. 42% of the solidly secular. So, contrary to popular belief, they have feelings too. Say religion and religious organizations do more harm than good in American society. Oh, more good than harm, sorry. Sunday stalwarts, 86%. Of course. Of course they're doing good. Everyone assumes they're moral. God and country, 77%. You know, churches are important. 72%, 27% attend services weekly. Churches are important. We're glad they're there. We don't necessarily give them any money. We don't necessarily show up on Sunday, but we sure want to keep them around. 70% diversely devout. 58%, 53%. The church has pretty good reputation amongst the first 5 groups. Now it falls off among the non-religious groups, your religion resistors and your solidly secular. Now notice again, the solidly secular are the opposite of the New Agers. These are the people that when you just have to say Deepak Chopra and away they run as a vampire from a crucifix, okay? 29%, that's almost 30% say, yeah, churches, they do some good. Religious organizations, they do some good. Very interesting. Say religious beliefs help a lot in family relationships. 76%. Religion and family, not real high in this survey. 76% Sunday stalwarts, yeah. Well, they believe it's good for their family, obviously. 54% God and country believers. I think there's a lot in this question, and if you, one of probably the most common areas where people flee from church will be church and family issues. Almost always. When people leave a church, it's a divorce, it's a family fight, see, church fights, you can usually kind of work with a church fight at a church because you're not living with these people. But family fights, almost impossible to keep going to church in the midst of a family fight. It's nearly impossible. It says religious beliefs help. Now, religious beliefs, not spiritual beliefs. Religious beliefs helps a lot in family relationships. Relaxed, religious, 21%. Spiritually awake, 17%. Religious resistors, 3%. Solidly secular, 1%. So what do they think helps with families? If you were to expand this, my guess would be psychology and therapy and counseling, because that's where Americans go for their advice with respect to families and marriage. Listen to the Jordan Peterson question and answer thing. Notice how many people bring him those kinds of questions. And, well, a fair amount come to church, but usually only, well, no, some come from others. But it's often because pastors are kind of free therapists, because today, if you're going to go see a therapist through your insurance company, it's probably a therapist just starting out, because all the best therapists don't take insurance. You have to pay directly, because the best therapists don't need to rely on insurance. They've already got a well-established practice. There's a few out there that will continue to accept it out of the kindness of their heart, but generally speaking, when it comes to therapy, it takes a lot of money. And, well, there you have it. So I just wanted to point out this very interesting survey, and when you go through it, think about religious, spiritual, these words that fudge, what the definitions mean. The religious landscape in America is far more complicated than we usually see reflected in the media. Again, the media likes to promote a narrative of Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are people who go to church. Democrats aren't people who don't go to church. And the media has all these narratives that they keep in terms of dualism and very simplified, because the majority of people can continue to follow these stories that are simplified. And they're good versus evil, they're right versus wrong. And if you've got a media that, for the most part, is dependent upon a marketplace and they are rewarded by gaining high numbers, this is the kind of thing you will go down to the most simplistic explanations possible. But if you look at, again, Sunday stalwarts, 17% of the population, not big. This is nationwide. So you've got relatively unchurched states like on the blue coasts. You've got highly churched states like in the Old South and in the Midwest. 17% are Sunday stalwarts. 12% are God and country believers. It's not big. 11%. The biggest groups in here are the Sunday stalwarts at 17, relaxed religious at 17, and solidly secular at 17. In other words, nobody even has 20% of the population. And what this means is that when we have conversations about spirituality, however you define that word, and religion, people are going to be all over the map. So there's a little video for you. I'll either release it on Friday, I'll release my rough draft for Sunday video today, or maybe it'll be a special Saturday treat. I often don't release videos on Saturday. For those of you who are paying very close attention, I do have the audio only podcast, and often when I post videos with YouTube, I can nicely kind of say, okay, I'll post this later, because I've noticed often when I post 2 videos at once, it's just the way people work, so I'll often separate them, but it's easier on the audio podcast to just post them both. So those of you who have both streams will notice that if you really want to get the inside first look, often you'll get the audio only podcast will come through right away. And I think I've got some ideas about how people use their technology, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's it for this video.